Welcome to another session of LeadX, leading by example in the world stuttering community. Today we have with us Jane Fraser of the Stuttering Foundation. Jane, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Tom. And we're both facing a hurricane today. So if we look
Yes,
a
we
little
are.
frazzled, I'm sure your viewers will understand.
Well, we would love to hear the story of the um, Stuttering Foundation, your father's vision. I mean, how he made this happen.
You know, it's interesting to me because, of course, I was definitely and still an infant when he started the foundation. So I do know from his, I do know from later years that stuttering, of course, was a real problem for him. As a child, I didn't realize that. He didn't stutter at home. I don't have any recollection whatsoever of hearing my father stutter at home. I knew when we were in outside situations later, we'd go on family vacations and had to stop at a motel and ask for a room. Then it would be Malcolm Fraser. And that was always, I sensed his frustration and his pain with that. But as a child living at home, I didn't have any feeling at all. I don't remember it being a topic as a child. I don't ever remember it being a topic at home. But of course, once it got organized, but of course, his intent was, first of all, that there wasn't any reason to start a foundation without money. The whole reason, the impetus for 1947 was the change in the tax law. He could donate to a foundation. He was seeing that there were foundations for other medical problems. And so he wrote to the local lawyers and said, I'd like to start a foundation to work to help people who stutter. And how do I do that? How do I get the tax exemption? So you see him going through in a very business-like way, which he always was, getting his 501c3, his tax deduction. And of course, then, so it was 5 or 6 years maybe before he felt he had the funding to do anything. And at that point, he went to see Charles Van Riper because he thought, when you're tackling a problem, you go to see whoever's recognized as the leading person. And Van Riper welcomed him. And a funny story, Van Riper in his memoirs say that my father arrived in a Cadillac. But in those days, General Motors had their own auto parts sales. And my father wouldn't have been caught dead in a Cadillac. So I think that, it's interesting how people remember things the way they want to remember them, isn't it? And I think in Van's mind, here was this businessman from Memphis, whom he envisaged as a rich man. At the time, we lived in a little one-bathroom house with one car. We were, my father would have died if he'd had to drive a Cadillac. So, and he continued to live. So, in later years, if he had to pay more than $1 for lunch with the guys on Friday, that he met up with the old retired people, if it was over $1, it was too much. And so anyway, so Van Riper tells the story his way. My father remembers going, and I know because he was the person who stuttered, he felt that he needed to make an impression on this Dr. Van Riper to help him. He couldn't move forward without the professionals. He wanted the professionals. And the interesting thing is, all the professionals of that day, that time, almost to the last one, everyone except Stan Ainsworth, all stuttered themselves. That was, of course, a guiding light, I think, for my father. So, of course, he was, like all of us, he was killing many birds with one stone. Yeah. He was starting to help other people. But of course, with that, he was finding answers for himself. And so the whole thing meshed nicely. They met at the very first conference. everybody haggled, as professors are wont to do. And Joe Sheehan was in charge of putting all that information together. And when Joe died, Vivian Sheehan, his widow, said to me, Jane, the little discs, I don't know, the little green discs that secretaries used to use in the 50s, they recorded these sessions on these little green plastic discs, would probably gone completely bad, by the time. Anyway, Joe Sheehan never did a thing with it. You couldn't, because there was no organization. The chairman at that conference was Charles Van Riper. So what I do remember is I had never heard another person stutter. And I was sitting in the back seat, and Van stuttered in his peculiar way, which was very different from my father. And it was like, wow, that's different, That's all that I remember. But driving back to Memphis, my father was in deep depression, because here he had great hopes for this conference. These men, the brilliant men, were brought together, and they ended up this 5-day conference or whatever with nothing on paper, no agreement. Everybody just disagreed on everything. Nobody would come up with a principle of what could help adults. But what came out of it was that Dad recognized that Stan Ainsworth was an organizer. So he had another conference, and Joe Sheehan was actually helped one of the organized it, and said, let's have a pre-conference so that we don't end up just arguing, and lay the ground rules. So they got organized. They met in Chicago, and that's another fun story. They stayed at the Palmer House, which was very expensive. And I think, again, my father wanted to ensure that these powerful, important professors would come, was going to have this meeting at the Palmer House Hotel. And Joe Sheehan relates that Dad went to call my mother to tell her that he had arrived safely. He went down to the lobby and put a dime in the phone, because it would have cost 25 cents to call from the room. So it just gives you an idea of how careful he was with every penny.
Yeah.
And you can see that with his spreadsheets. I mean, he was the equivalent of today's CPAs. He was a money manager, but anyway, a lot of anecdotes. I think it makes him into a real person.
Yeah.
It's not just some guy up here. So anyway, that conference did in fact end up in a booklet for adults who stutter. And that was kind of the pattern. Was then 2 years or 3 years later, there was enough money to have another group. And that first one was in the Caribbean. And once again, it was to entice these important professors to come. So not just was it in a lovely location, but the other thing that's kind of fun, Dad was very worried that Van Riper was sort of in competition with Wendell Johnson in terms of theories, and in terms of, were they going to fight, or were they going to work together, and so that's where alcohol played an important part, because they had a good drink before in the evenings. And I think, also the wives, the families were, the other kids. I knew the Van Riper kids. I knew the Johnson's daughter. She was 16 and I was 12, and she just kind of hung the moon. She was so important and a cool teen. And so there was the family ties, and the same thing that you would feel at an NSA meeting, just everybody meeting, families, children, sharing that, sharing the stuttering. And so it was really, a very small and select support group, but really, when you think about it, a support group working to come up with ideas to help people overall. So again, I think the resiliency that during the failure, thinking through what went wrong at the first meeting, who could chair the meeting, laying the groundwork, what made it fail, what made it a success, all those same things that we all deal with in everyday life. But I think the courage to move ahead. I can remember one of the support group leaders saying to me, I just don't know if I can carry on. I need help. And I thought to myself, well, if they need help already at this stage, they're not going to make it. Well, they did toughen up and carried on and ended up doing a great job. But I think, you need to realize that you can't pass the buck. Once you've made that commitment, then you get up every day and you do it. And it's that, is it Bill Cosby that said 90% of life is showing up? Who is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's really what it is. And I think the other thing is when you recognize that you've made a mistake, is just you shift gears. I was thinking today, I was telling Rochelle, who works here, that many years ago, we used a small print company in Memphis, and they failed to pay their employment taxes. And the government came in, shut them down, and all of our books were inside. So
Ooh.
they were locked down. There were our books. And they basically went bankrupt. And was at that point that I met George Cooley at Mercury Printing. And George came down to look and kind of talk to the Internal Revenue Service people and try to get in there to get the materials that belong to us, trying to talk them into the fact that we could get those out, even though they wanted to shut this company down. And it turned out that George Cooley stuttered himself, and it stuttered all his life. And so what was a horrible, really scary time for me. I hadn't been in this job for more than maybe 5 years max. Was all of a sudden my whole print house has gone out of business and my books are locked in, and finding George Cooley, going with Mercury Printing, working with him to start the newsletter. He was just brilliant. He was just a wonderful person to work with, and just made suggestions that made our products better. And so what was a horrible thing turned into a wonderful thing. And that happens so many times, don't you find? That when you just think you've come to the end of the road, in fact, it opens up a whole new door. But if you give up at that point, yeah. And I know that it doesn't always have that kind of, I'm only remembering the happy instances. And I think that's another important thing is don't dwell on the failures. Don't dwell on this moment of stuttered speech. Same, whether it's the shutdown of the print house, or whether it's a moment of stuttered speech, or whether it's losing a local election, which I lost last year. Not dwelling on that, but moving ahead. And I've had people come up to me and say, but hey, you lost that election. And I'll say, no, I didn't. I learned from that. And now I can move ahead. Now I can say what I really think. Now that I'm not a candidate, I can really get out there and fight. So I'm trying to turn what some might consider a loss or a failure into what I think is probably freedom to say what I think, freedom to move ahead in a different direction. I think that's whether it applies to stuttering, whether it applies to your life, whether it applies to your marriage, it's just moving ahead. So anyway, but you wanted to hear more about Malcolm. At no point did he ever lose sight of moving ahead. I think, and he felt very, very good about the Van Riper process of, his voluntary stuttering. He did follow through on that, and that helped him tremendously. He was a wonderful listener. Now, whether he was a listener, a better listener, and a more concerned individual because he stuttered, I can't help but think that influenced his personality, that was part of what made him the really cool person that he was. He ended up training all the future leaders of the Genuine Parts Company. They almost all came out of Memphis. I think he never wanted to leave the Memphis warehouse. My uncle said, Malcolm, we'd love to have you run the New York warehouse. We'd love to. And Dad said, no, I don't want to move. I think that was because of the stuttering. He knew where he was. He knew all of his employees. And I know you've heard a million times the story about the birthday interviews, but he did
Please tell
interview.
it again.
All right. Well, he had an hour-long birthday interview with every employee, and there were 400 at the end. So there was not a day that went by that he didn't spend an hour with an employee. And he would ask them if they're happy on the job, how the company could do better, what improvements they need to make, what they wanted to be happier, what could they do to, and of course, most people wanted a raise. But his response to that was, when you help us earn more money, we can give you a raise.
Yeah.
So it got everybody focused on selling more auto parts, doing a better job. How can we make this a more comfortable warehouse? How can we speed up the orders? How can we help you while you're taking orders on the phone? I'm thinking about, a headset. For the girls in the early days were holding the phone up like that. So all sorts of really good ideas came out of these birthday interviews. But I think this is, of course, after the fact. I suspect that he not only loved people and wanted them to succeed, and that was a big part of it. He wanted to know his employees. But I think also, but by knowing them in that way, he was not afraid to stutter with them. So that when he ran into them in the warehouse, he would know something about them. He would be comfortable. And so when my uncle said, Malcolm, we really need you to run the New York warehouse. And he said, no, I think it was that comfort level that was his niche. And he was, yeah. And so the whole idea of, inventory control was a kind of a big deal when I worked in the warehouse. Well, the first year I just pulled auto parts, but then they put me on the desk, which I didn't like nearly as much. I loved being in the warehouse part.
Yeah.
Well, all the college guys were back there. Back. And we had fun in the back. Once I was on the car desk, but what I did on the car desk was inventory control. Because what made Genuine Parts function was some guy would call out, and he was out in the country and his tailpipe fell off. So he called his local auto parts dealer, and the guy would call the warehouse and say, have you got tailpipe number XYZ? And because of the card desk and keeping the inventory up every night, the card desk would enter what had been sold. So this is before computers, remember? So, I mean, you're not old enough to remember, but yeah. So we'd enter it by hand. So when that guy called, we could say, oh yeah, we got 2 XYZ tailpipes. We'll get them down to you. So then the truck would leave at 5 o'clock, would leave and rumble down to that store. And the next morning, the guy would have his tailpipe. And that was the success of the company. And there was a fellow named Jimmy Hamer who was a human computer.
Oh.
And under him worked a fellow named Larry Prince. Larry Prince became chairman of the board of Genuine Parts in Atlanta and ran the company when they got $1 billion in sales. But he and I started together in the warehouse pulling parts. And then I was working on that inventory control when he was learning the system from the Jimmy Hamer guy. So it's the whole, so anyway, all of that just emanated from Memphis, I think. That was again my father. What makes it work? It didn't start in the company headquarters are in Atlanta, they still are, but those systems and that kind of faithfulness to what works and what doesn't, I think was an outgrowth of all that listening to the employees, what works, what doesn't, how can we make this a better company. I just did an interview yesterday with a magazine called for electrical engineers. And one of the things they asked me, because they've been running public service ads for us for years, they said, we want to do an article about you and about the charity that you run. And, and I said, I think it's really important for employers. And Joe Fulcher, my husband, always talked about fitting the person to the job. Don't try to fit the job to the person. And so I think that's important for employers when they hire someone who stutters. I think first of all, it's important for that person who stutters to be upfront about where they think their talents are. So it may not be on the hotline, but it may be in discovering how to do inventory control, for example. It may be, so for both sides to be open. And that way, you don't have this misunderstanding later about you didn't fill the expectations that I had of you. So making sure that the expectations that the employer has, and then when you go in to look for a job, if you're a person who stutters, to also tell that employer where you think your strengths lie. And then you don't have this unpleasantness afterwards if you have, yeah. And so, I'll just give you an example here. We had a wonderful person in Memphis that did the kids' letters for our newsletter, Joan. And Joan died 2.5 years ago. And I said to Rachel here, oh, she said, I could never do what Joan did. And I said, well, try. Well, it is out that she's connecting with these kids. She's doing every bit as great a job as Joan did. And I just started out saying, try with a couple, see how it goes. If you're not the right person, we'll find somebody else. So taking the pressure off a little bit. But it turns out she took it a step further and she's loving it, And so she's sitting down there. She's got 52 kids' letters right now. She's getting them ready for the next newsletter. And she's connecting not only with the children who stutter, but also with their therapist and then the parents. And then we see on Facebook, one of the parents says, oh, my child was in the Stuttering Foundation newsletter and we got a copy. And then there's all the fun of seeing your own name in print. And I try to tell this to therapists because people write and they say, oh, we don't want a paper copy anymore. You're wasting paper now. But they don't understand that for a child to see his own letter in print, it's you can see it on a phone or on a screen, but it's different if you see it in print. You've got the hard copy, something you can hold in your hand, and that's your name and your letter in there. And so maybe we can talk to your audience about that, but I think hard copy paper, as long as we can afford it, we will continue doing the newsletter because I just think that the printed word is just so important. We get that feedback. But again, fitting the job to the person, not the person to the job. So for me too, I took things in different directions because I thought we could have the best books in the world. When I moved back, we had 5 books. We could have the best books in the world, but if we don't sell ourselves, if we don't convince people, if we don't find a way to advertise them and let the public know. And my father was very good at that. He reached out to Walter Annenberg himself and said, would you give me some publicity in TV Guide? Well, heck, it had 23 million circulation.
Yeah.
And Annenberg wrote back and gave him, a couple $1,000 worth of free space.
Wow.
Yeah. So he didn't hesitate. So as time went by, he didn't hesitate again to go to the top and reach out directly to the own. Well, he knew that Walter Annenberg stuttered, and oh gosh, let me do that. Thank you. He knew that Walter Annenberg stuttered, and so of course that was a connection. And I think that Annenberg had gone to Charles Van Riper for help, because there were very few people in the 50s and 60s that you could go to for help with stuttering. Remember Iowa, I think Katie Van Riper was she was the first woman to graduate as a speech pathologist, I think.
Oh.
She was a wonderful therapist, by the way. Yeah. So you've let me talk too much.
I could listen to you all day, Jane.
You're right.
So how would you describe your father's leadership style when it came to stuttering related organizations compared to like business? Did he treat it, um, did he have the same management style? Did he do things differently when working with volunteers?
No,
Hmm.
I don't think so. No, I think it was absolutely the same style. And I think, because like I said in the beginning, he was interested in seeing that each of his employees in the auto parts business succeeded in their own way. He would counsel them. I mean, I know that it sounds like it was paternalism, for sure. He wanted them to succeed in their marriage. He wanted them to succeed in their lives. He wanted them to be happy on the job, because he knew if they were happy on the job, they'd do a good job. The same with working with the professors. I think he wanted it to be harmonious. I think it was a bigger challenge for him, because he could be more practical maybe in the auto parts business than he could in the world of university professors. I mean, he continually had to say, how is this going to help people who stutter in an everyday way? I mean, you can talk about this, you can talk about that happening, but how is that going to help a person who stutters when they're in this situation? So he was constantly bringing them back down to earth. That was, I'm sure, very frustrating for him. What was good for me was that I was hearing that I grew up watching that, because remember, I went to every conference, even the earliest. I was at the earliest conference. I was just a teenager, but I was able to, if I didn't sit in on all the meetings, I was at least aware of what happened. But of course, I began to sit in on all the meetings once I was a teenager. So I heard all the squabbling. And so, when I heard it in the 80s and 90s, it was nothing new to me. I'd heard it in the 50s and 60s. And I also knew ahead of time. He kept me grounded, in preparing me to kind of deal with this. Because the problem that you run into, that you wouldn't run into in your employees in an auto parts situation. I mean, yes, people think they're right. Most people think they know the right thing to do. And of course, the college professors are used to teaching a class.
Yeah.
It's kind of like doctors, they tell you what to do. Take an aspirin, take this, take that. They're not good listeners. I'm sorry about this phone ringing. Let me
It's
turn this
okay.
bell off. Yeah. So you're dealing with egos.
Mm. Mhm.
Now, that's the other advantage to people, to dealing with professors who stuttered themselves, and why he felt so comfortable he really didn't want to invite people who didn't stutter themselves. He did in the end. He invited my Dutch friend Els Versteeg, and he said, Jane, you were right to invite Els. She's brilliant. I think she's really contributed to our meeting, which made me really happy. And she did. She had a very deep understanding of stuttering. She was one of the best therapists in the world. So she was working out of Amsterdam. I had met her because I was in Paris. She had asked me to come up and speak to her group of speech pathologists. And I was absolutely terrified. So I thought, what on earth can I say to this brilliant group of people in the Netherlands? You know, I had not yet moved back to the States. So we're talking 1981 here. So I came up with a great solution, which you could call avoidance technique. I said, I will bring the Van Riper tapes and we can project them on the screen. And if anybody has any trouble translating, I can explain what it is he's saying. So it got me off the hook. She said, you have to come up and talk to my group. And I thought, I've been exposed. They're going to realize that I know absolutely nothing. It'd be awful. Oh, the trepidations, the butterflies in the stomach. It was awful. I had never given a speech in public either in my life. You know, that's thanks to Joe Fulcher, who said, you can talk about stuttering at a cocktail party. Why can't you stand up and talk in front of people? Oh, I said, I'll pass out. There's just no way I can. I was terrified of public speaking. This is after I got married. So anyway, I've been there. But anyway, I think, you know, he was comfortable, but nonetheless, there was a little of that discomfort. He wasn't about to contradict anybody, but he could feel comfortable saying, let's be practical, bring this down to a level where people can profit from it, where it can truly help them with their stuttering. It needs to make a difference for them. That's why we're here. So in that sense, you're right, it was a different management style, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. But in the overall wanting to connect with these people, because he would always find out about their lives. He always was good at talking, you know, how long you've been married and how many children, and are you happy in your job at the university? They knew that he cared about them as people, not just because they were there as a professor. I think everyone who ever met my father knew that he cared about them as people. And I think, you know, today when people say, you know, I met you 40 years ago, and I'll say, well, I remember you. You were at Northwestern Workshop. They're always surprised. But I think he gave me that gift of, I remember them, of course. Why would I not remember them? But I think you remember people because they're important to you.
Yeah.
I hear that a lot. How do you remember me? Well, why would I not remember you? You know, for me, that's just foreign. And you know, I do kind of regret the workshops now, the 2-week workshops. Of course, I was able to stay 3 or 4 days and really get to know people. Now, if I'm only at a workshop for a day or two, but I always study their applications. I think people don't realize how much their applications say about who they are when they're applying to the workshop. You know right away if you can tell by their application whether they think they're right about everything or whether they're truly searching for more learning.
Hmm.
I always ask, there's one of the questions on the application to our training workshops is, when something isn't working, how do you know to shift gears? That tells me if they're thinking. Or do you just go straight ahead with what you're doing and not? In other words, are you listening to your patients,
Right.
to your clients? Or are you just sure? And if they already know everything, then why come to the workshop? So I
That's true.
generally put a C- on those applications. It's interesting. I don't think people, it's like a job interview. Again, I learned from Joe and I learned from my father. If you just let people talk,
Yeah.
then you learn everything that you need to know. And job interviews are dreadful things. They're just dreadful. I think they're just as hard for the employer as they are. I was always really embarrassed about interviewing people, especially if 5 minutes into the interview, I knew I wasn't going to hire them. I just felt like I'm wasting your time. You're wasting my time. But I didn't want to say that. So, of course, I would continue to talk to them, but I sort of knew ahead of time. And I always the same. If somebody's worked for a company for 10 years, they're quite different than somebody who's worked here a year, here 6 months, here 3 months. They're same with running a group. If somebody's run a support group for 3 months and then they've jumped to this other one and then they did that for a few months, you know perfectly well they're not going to be in it for the long haul. So there again, it's the same kind of, that's what you're looking for. Now, when I was in France, I just took whatever job I could get. So it wasn't a question of quitting. It was more a question of what's available. I mean, when I first got there and I had my college degree, I thought I had hung the moon. I was the smartest thing in the world. And I tried to get a job and I ended up looking for a job as a sales girl at Galeries Lafayette and I thought I'll apply for a job at Air France. Here I am in Paris, I speak English and French both a little bit, and I'll just apply for a job. I couldn't stand not working. I had gotten married. There I was, fresh out of college. And the job Air France offered me was typing for 600 francs a month, which is like $120 a month. And I would have had to take the subway out to the airport to type all day, come back all the way into Paris.
Wow.
All of that for $120 a month. And Pierre
Wow.
said to me, oh, that you're going to be exhausted. And, for pennies, a franc an hour. Well, anyway, I ended up knocking on doors, and I ended up working for American Field Service in Paris and typing. And now I shouldn't be talking about jumping, but I said, I'll do whatever job you've got. And they said, well, we need somebody to type up the applications of our exchange students. And I said, I'll do it. They say, we'll pay you a franc a page. So if I could go fast, I could earn more. And it was a French typewriter with the keys are in a different place. Didn't take me long to figure out where those keys were. And then after about 3-4 months, they said, we'd like to promote you. We need to send you out to the airport to the exchange student is arriving. Would you meet her at gate? So I got into that. And then by the time I finished, the office manager's husband was moving to Brussels. She asked me if I'd do that. And I said, I'm expecting my first child. I can do it for a while, but I don't know how this is going to go. So yeah, I did a little jumping in those years. But then I did translation work at home. I did whatever paid. I taught English for a while. I took tour groups around Paris. And then I got a job doing editing in the oncology field, and that was thrilling. Really worked for the man that really did the basic work on stem cells and immunology in France. and went on to be head of the Cancer Institute of France. So that was fabulous. But and that's another advice that I have to people looking for a job. Take whatever you can get, because if you can show that you're interested,
Yeah.
like I was earning 1 franc a page, but because I was willing to take that job and move up, and I said that to my daughter in France, and she got a job selling newspapers in the street, and within 1 year she was a recording artist because she met a photographer. He introduced her to a musician, and from then on her career was launched. But if she had turned that initial job of selling the newspapers in the street, none of that would have happened. And her college roommates were still jobless 3 years later because they were waiting for the perfect job. So more advice.
That's an amazing story. I have not heard that one yet. That is really amazing.
Well, it's
I,
not really amazing. It's just you just move ahead. You just
yeah,
keep
yeah,
going.
yeah. So Jane, you're in a unique situation because you've had close contact with probably all of the long-term leaders of all the Southern support organizations throughout the world for a long time.
Yes.
If you could uh, build the um, build the perfect stuttering support organization leader, what qualities do you think are the ones to really focus on, the ones to cultivate, the ones to work on that would make you a successful and a long-term leader in the stuttering community?
Well, when what you're talking about is, I think that they must have the dedication. They got to have that basic dedication to helping others. And that, of course, now you've finally gotten me to where I probably should have started 45 minutes ago. And that is that my father's dedication to helping others. You have to have that dedication. I think that dedication is found in unique individuals who just, they have it, whether they're become physicians, whether they become ministers, whether they become leaders of support groups like you and others have done, whether they become foundation leaders. They are people who are dedicated to helping other people. And I see it locally too with the people who rescue animals. It's the same idea. They don't say, I'm not getting up today. I'm not going to go feed at 4 a.m. They're up and they're feeding. You see that in farmers. You see that in this kind of dedication that others are depending on you, that you cannot forsake them. That's crucial. That's got to be there. And so because of that underlying desire to help others and dedication to building an organization, because of that, all the other things kind of fall into place, because the people you meet are the people that you're helping. And if you're not interested in them and their success, I mean, it just fits. Clearly, the people that you've met with your World Stuttering Network, you want to know that they're succeeding. It's like, I'm just thinking about this wonderful fellow from Zimbabwe, Wonder Neone, whom I met years ago and sent him a self-therapy book. And Wonder said, I want to be the Wonder that my mother told me I could be. He went to South Africa. He became a leader in the mining business. He is now one of the leaders of a mining company. He's been sent to Orlando to train. And yet there he was in Zimbabwe, a person who stutters, who said, I want to be a success. And we followed him through all those years. The other one was a young man who wrote me for the first time in 2008 from Eritrea, of all the poor countries in the world. He has just arrived in Canada. Thanks to Judy Custer and her friends and years of being in refugee camps, this young man who stutters, he's not young anymore, all these years. 2008, I told him I still had the first letter he wrote to me. but he has succeeded in his life. He's working now in the outskirts of Toronto. He's a wonderful. So watching these different people succeed is a thrill for people who have that desire to lead. So that's just, it's all kind of fits together, doesn't it? That dedication. So it's dedication, it's courage when it looks like things are not going to work out. That ability to just stay in touch with those people, but also with your goals and to stick with them. Yeah, not give up.
So what do you think your father would say, and what would you say to the up and coming future leaders of our stuttering organizations?
Just stick to it, be resilient. Don't get discouraged. Don't, have the courage to carry on even when you get, everyone get, I think it's important to understand, like relapse. It's important to understand everyone has their days when they're discouraged. They may not show it, but they do. And understanding that that we've all been there, and that, it may look as if it's easy looking at people that have already accomplished things, but it wasn't. And, that was something my father said. I said, oh, I wish I had so-and-so's job. And he'd say, what makes you think he's so happy? And I said, well, he's a big success and everybody looks up to him. And he said, you don't really know that. What makes you think that his job is better than yours? He would always say things like that. I came home having visited with some bankers, and I said, they'll do a great job of investment. And he said, what makes you think they'll do a better job than you? Why don't you study these, subscribe to this investment portfolio thing, read it, and you can do as good a job. He was right. So what makes you think they're happier than you are? What makes you think that they're, it's interesting. Is that maybe that's a little solution focused brief therapy 50 or 60 years before it became, but really it's look within yourself. You may be a lot more talented than you give yourself credit for. It's another way to kind of encourage them. You can do it. I think telling young people they can do it, but it does involve stick-to-itness, and involves what I like to call courage. Stick to it. And, find yourself a mentor. No matter who it is, find yourself the leaders that are out there today, and follow them and watch what they're doing, and have the courage to get out there and meet people. And it's there's certainly, I have met people in my life with stuttering that is so severe that I do wonder how they keep going. It takes courage, doesn't it? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So,
Jane, there are so many nuggets of gold throughout this podcast. And I just want to thank you again for sharing the stories, sharing your experience and your thoughts, and sharing your father with us. I have really enjoyed this time that we spent together. And thank you for squeezing this into your busy schedule. I know it is jam packed.
no, it isn't. It's not so busy that I don't always have time. And so anyway, thank you for listening to me babbling on. I hope that I can inspire people to move forward and not be discouraged. And I do recognize how difficult that can be sometimes. So, if people need help or advice or whatever, I would urge them to reach out to you and to me and to all those people out there who are in helping professions. They're good. They're good people, and they're there to help. So thank you, Tom.
One closing thought for you, don't feel bad about losing the election. When I ran for city council, I made it past the primary, and I came in dead last.
Well, that's probably what they'd say about me. But anyway.
But what an experience that is, of people that I've met and everything. So
It's
it wasn't
amazing, isn't
meant
it?
to be on city council. It wasn't meant to gobble up more of my time. But it was fun. I enjoyed it. So
try again, because you're young enough to try again.
when I have time.
Stay involved. And that's important for people who stutter to that's a whole other lesson. But silence and you can control your audience. You can learn like Churchill. Moments of silence are incredibly powerful. So use it. Turn it into a positive for yourself. They're going to have to wait because you're up there at the podium. They're going to have to wait because you got your 3 minutes or however much they give you nowadays, 5 minutes, and just have the courage to stick it out. It's hard. Thank you, Tom.
But thank you once again, Jane. I just totally enjoyed this.
Good.
So,
thank you so much.
Jane Fraser, thank you once again.
Bye.